So I may find very simply that trusting in some people is very beneficial as regards what I value in living. Freedom from pain, safety, freedom from hunger and want, perhaps freedom from isolation and loneliness, some behaviours relating to others. I need some sort of trust in them to be willing to put any effort into joint actions that are beneficial to me. And I find, of course, that it has to be beneficial to them as well. So I start to have notions of consideration of others. And in a sense, this becomes a widening of my view of self, in that I'm taking what I think will benefit them into my reasoning and decision as to how to act and behave. And so very simply, something like the Jesus story says, well, if you see God as existing, all-powerful, and in fact a heavenly Father, loving Father, a good parent, someone that measures up to what you think a good parent is extremely efficacious, very beneficial in this fellowshipping with others, or harmony in relationship to others, if not actually interrelating with them, perhaps avoiding some that are quite difficult in this regard. This is not something that we can obviously build into a computer at the minute. It's functionally very able in handling data and responding to input commands, but it doesn't seem to be independently functional like a person that has loyalty, predictability in that sense of purpose. It seems to be reliant on whoever's programming it as regards whether it's active at present or not. In other words, it doesn't seem to be self-motivated in a value sense, or in a thinking sense, other than simply data mining according to the associations of the data that's already fixed in it. It doesn't seem to be able to program itself, whereas people do seem to be able to do this. And their functioning and activity seems to be self-motivated. A computer seems to be entirely dependent on its operator, although the operator may not understand the consequences of some of the commands he puts into the machine. The machine is dead without the operator. It's as if he, you can imagine a computer that streams on forever calculating, say, prime numbers, and it will continue to do this sort of indefinitely until the operator suggests some other activity. Whereas persons are relating all the time to other persons. Computers have to be formally linked, but persons seem to relate simply by coming into proximity and influence on each other, and have this sense of self and purpose and something of feeling, joy. In other words, joy or stress or fear are according to expectations of the future, consequences of actions, and how they affect such values. It's hard to build into a computer values. And of course it doesn't have this ability to repair itself. It can go back to an earlier state, reboot, original maker's program, the software. Persons have a great resistance to this. You try and reboot someone so that they, now love someone they didn't love before, or hate someone that they did love before. Circumstances can happen that seem to affect this. But to purposefully achieve it in some other person, it's very difficult indeed. I don't say it's impossible, but they are extremely resistant to being operated on. Whereas a computer seems to be designed to be operated on. And perhaps in that sense, what is hated about religion is that religion seems to be, if not originally purposed, but designed in outcome for someone else to affect your values and purposes and goals. In other words, it's fear we have of it being a mind control that's not in our true best interest as we would see it, but for its imposition. And so we come to hate religion. It's not seen as our salvation at all, but as the consequence, having a consequence of imprisoning us in great restriction of life. We could come to a point where we see our society as not overall beneficial, but extremely troublesome and enslaving. And you start to get the historistic communist call of we've nothing to lose but our chains. So you get a revolutionary, rebellious spirit. And religion hates this. It's a tool of the state if you're not careful. We are careful and it still becomes a tool of the state. The state is some sort of entity which is not a person, but seems to be a great enemy. And the only way of coping with this enemy, becomes a complete breakdown of society, which could have otherwise ideally been a great blessing to us. Let me pause. So in a sense, by my definition of spiritual, all persons by definition are spiritual. They're certainly not all religious. Religion seems to be something that is descriptive of society and something of its culture and ways of controlling itself, as if it had a personhood, a self. that should be supported and encouraged in some way because it's presumably a great blessing to the individuals. If it's not, then of course, as I say, you come nearer to rebellion and overthrow this state imposition of self, albeit in the form of religion rather than, say, secular law and order, police state. So yes, we seek a society that's beneficial to the individual. We have many individuals, and how do you suit everybody? Are their desires and needs and goals harmonious and consistent? And we don't know. And how do you measure it? I mean, you can't measure utility or happiness or value in that sense. You can only observe what they do, and how do we supposedly recognize welfare? We look at national income, or expenditure, which is just a summation of market valuations of activity. It's as if we can't do much better. But we can be extremely critical of whether such is of much value in our understanding of whether society is successful or not. But I want to say that the spiritual side of man, these features like trust and hope and motivation and evaluation, the notions of good and bad and what is wanted and what is not wanted, are specifically what we mean by human personhood. And animals may have more or less of such abilities, including mankind. But it's this side of the person that is extremely important. I mean, their physical side is too. How they can act, how they do act, how they appear, what they seem to purpose. Objective data like this. But subjective data is incredibly important when it comes to resolution, purpose, goal-seeking behavior, and outcome. So we seek to understand the spiritual such that we exercise it in a way that brings what we value. And in many ways what we value is common to us all. We seem to value something like what we would tag as happiness, joy, peace, assurance, hope, creativity, security, fellowship, communion. I don't know, there's a lot of aspects we can throw in there that seem to be very important. What we might call the spiritual side of man. It doesn't say he's religious or anything. It might result in him being religious and choose religion or find religions imposed on him. But it's not religion in itself. It's not material, not terribly measurable, only its consequences, or what we declare about such. Are you happy about this? Rate it 1 to 5. 5 is very happy, 1 is very unhappy. or -5 is really seriously unhappy, and +5 is seriously happy. I mean, we can attempt at things like, but I mean, and then to make interpersonal comparisons and aggregations doesn't seem rational at all. There's all sorts of problems in rationality then. In other words, the data doesn't seem to be there to be objective and simply rely on reasoning. It's far more complex than that. From the point of view of predictability, reliability of outcome and understanding, without which we're in some degree of chaos all the time and trying to cope with it the best we can. And it's finding the best we can that's most important. In other words, the spiritual side of our personhood is just about everything in some ways. To whether we're even willing to continue living, leave alone what we achieve or don't achieve. Thank you, Heavenly Dad. And I say thank you, Heavenly Dad, because in these wanderings of the mind, so to speak, that these YouTube videos, well, they're not videos, these podcasts, aren't they, really, that I do on YouTube, are about this person side of being that's so important and so demanding of our faculties of understanding from the point of view of our well-being. And I find, not the only person who's found it, of course, that there are some very simple things we can do that make life incredibly better. And seeing God as existing and as perhaps all-powerful, perhaps all-loving person to us all, that he's our dad in Jesus' terms, loving and kind, has an incredibly beneficial consequence on our spiritual well-being and therefore our well-being in total. But you have to taste to see. It's not something that can be proved to you. Only something you can choose to practice or not. And you won't if you're happy with your present circumstance. You'll carry on until you're not. Then you may search around for such other answers. So, those that have ears to hear, let them hear. We really can't do much about the others. We might try to manipulate their circumstance to good as we see it, but they might fiercely resist this. They're not ready for it. They're not wanting it yet. You might say yet. They would say, well, hopefully never. And hope is something of spirit again. Thank you, Heavenly Dad.